And KNUS. My next guest, Roshini Rajkumar, is a strategic communication and crisis coach to C-suite executives, host of Real Talk with Roshini on WCCO Radio Sundays in Minnesota, in Minneapolis, and the Real Leaders with Roshini podcast. She is a licensed attorney and former TV news reporter, author of the book Communicate That, with her website ownyourwow.com. And she has been following very, very closely, doing shows and reporting on and being on court TV and all over the place, talking about what's been happening in terms of the Derek Chauvin trial over the death of George Floyd, with the jury now going into deliberations. And of course, then amidst the trial and everything that's been happening there, on Sunday, you have another police shooting that killed a black man, Dante Wright, age 20. This officer apparently thought that she was using a taser, but it was a gun, and he was killed in the process, of course, bringing about protests and riots alike. Let's break all of this down with Roshini Rajkumar live from Minneapolis. Roshini, good morning. Welcome back.
Good morning. Thanks so much, Jimmy.
It's great to have you as always. And boy, is there so much to talk about here as arguments have wrapped up in the George Floyd killing trial of Derek Chauvin, former police officer Derek Chauvin. What's your top line takeaway from the past 3 weeks?
You know, it's been really emotional on many levels, not just in the courtroom, but around the city, around the Twin Cities. Lots of tensions. You know, it's one of those things where I don't have a sense of whether you all in Denver and Colorado are following it in the way that we are here, but it really, just takes over the headlines. And you know, you and I have talked on your show and on other shows on your station about the intense scrutiny even from the beginning during jury deliberations, because cameras are being allowed inside this trial. Really historic. The first time in Minnesota a trial like this is getting covered gavel to gavel with cameras inside. Court TV's cameras are inside, and we can all see because of that. And you know, it also, for me as a licensed attorney, makes me question, should we know all that we know about the jurors and those kinds of things? Will their safety be, especially now they're going to be sequestered and getting ready to be sequestered and then start their jury deliberations after closing arguments on Monday. So I think about the jury safety. I think about just the community safety. We had night number 5 Thursday night of protests in Brooklyn Center, which was the small town suburb of Minneapolis where that Sunday shooting happened, as well as crime all over Minneapolis. The last count I saw, 140 businesses in Minneapolis vandalized this week because of spillover rioting and vandalism in Minneapolis, spilling over from Brooklyn Center. I mean, people using that as a reason, which I think, you know, criminal activity, there's never a good reason for it, but that's the ethos right now in some corners of my community, and that's really sad, and I think we've seen it in other parts of the country. So it doesn't help that this murder trial is happening and then that shooting happens. I mean, it's very hard to not link, you know, the emotion of everything together. So as I've been talking about it on my show and going on other media outlets to talk about it, I always try to help us remember, be reasonable, remember the voice of reason. This is about one person on trial. He is also afforded due process, and the defense attorney, his main goal was to enter reasonable doubt into the minds of the jurors. Personally, as an attorney, just looking at it, watching, I do think he entered that reasonable doubt, but you never know what a jury is going to do. I will say that most judges and lawyers will tell you juries take their job very seriously. So it's now in the hands of the jury, especially after Monday's closing arguments.
From a legal standpoint, Roshini Rajkumar, how do you assess overall the two sides? Because obviously the prosecution has to make that case beyond a reasonable doubt. You're saying that the defense was able to at least introduce reasonable doubt. Of course, you're not on the jury, but you have a real sense for what the arguments are. You've been watching this so closely. What's your sense for the two arguments and what went on over the past 3 weeks in that regard?
Well, the count that I've seen was this jury saw 45 witnesses, 35 from the prosecution, 7 from the defense. And I thought from the beginning, even before I knew what the defense's case in chief would look like, that the prosecution was just introducing too many witnesses. There were a lot of medical witnesses. There were a lot of past law enforcement, a couple of people that whether they were use of force expert or not, were talking about use of force. So I think that was a little bit of, excuse the term, but overkill on the prosecution's part, because if you really have a solid case, do you really have to jam all these witnesses down the throats of the jury? And as attorneys will tell you, you don't want to bore the jurors either. And I'm told by some of the reporters who are inside, and you've seen some of that also reported, that sometimes jurors looked a little bored, or they're kind of, rolling their eyes at some of the things. So that's also something you have to manage as an attorney, not only getting everything accurate and covering all bases and how you're presenting your case, but you've got to think about different emotions and capacities of the jury to take things in. And no one knows, to the extent that the jury and those attorneys inside the courtroom and the witnesses, what the jury might be believing or not, as well as they do. I mean, we can all from the outside be giving analysis and helping people walk through it, but not having seen, and we won't see because they're the jury, not having really seen the jurors' reactions themselves, I can't give you a 100% guarantee that this witness bored the jury or this witness was effective. What I can say is that each side had some solid wins for witnesses and some solid wins on cross-examination. And overall, I would say all the attorneys in this case, it is a very crazy case and will be one of those cases of most of our lifetimes. And I would say the lawyers in general all did a really good job. I think the prosecution had too many witnesses. I think there were times when Eric Nelson, the defense attorney, could have gone a little harder, not necessarily forcefully, but he could have walked us through a little more of that initial video, Jimmy, and I've talked about this on your show before, that initial video when those rookie officers encountered George Floyd on May 25th, 2020, shows that he was already saying, I can't breathe, long before Derek Chauvin showed up. And I never really saw that video used for that specific reason. I mean, I might have missed it if it was, but I think that could have been really held out there, because what most of us are remembering, even though there's a lot of other video and other images in this case, most people remember that Facebook video, the 9 minutes, however many seconds, and that was several minutes into the whole encounter. So that will always be a question for me if I can ever one day interview Eric Nelson as to why he chose to do his case in chief the way he did. Now, his final witness on use of force, medical witness, was actually quite good. I thought he was believable and held up fairly well in cross-examination. So it will be interesting. And then I don't know if you saw this on Thursday, Jimmy, but the jury wasn't in the courtroom, and the judge was making rulings on how the rebuttal case from the prosecution would go, and there were various motions. And the judge said if a certain thing was mentioned about a toxicology test, that would be declared a mistrial right away. And it was interesting because Dr. Tobin started to talk about it, and I held my breath because I thought we might have a mistrial right there. So I was a little surprised that Eric Nelson didn't, he objected, but we didn't go more into that at that stage. So also keep in mind there may be settlement decisions, happening, or plea agreements, as they're called in criminal. There might be some of those negotiations happening over the weekend. So I can tell you, my station, WCCO Radio, we are preparing for possible riots this weekend or any after effect. I don't want to insert the term riots when not necessary, but we have been told to prepare for any case scenario this weekend if a plea deal comes out.
Wow. Roshini Rajkumar joining us, licensed attorney and radio host in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Just a real quick observation from my perspective. When you say 35 prosecution witnesses versus 7 defense witnesses, that is 5 times the number, exactly 5 times the number of defense witnesses. You say too many witnesses. It's interesting because I would think that They were trying to go with a sort of strength in numbers argument in the prosecution, overwhelm the jury by the number of medical experts and former law enforcement officials and all these different people, and get the jury to think, oh, well, there are so many people who are making this argument that it's not they're trying to get them to think, maybe from a strategic standpoint, think about the number of people who are on our side versus what the weight of the arguments and the evidence is. Perhaps that could be the psychology there.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, when the state has a very high burden of proof. Beyond a reasonable doubt in criminal cases is a very big burden, right? I mean, it's the biggest burden, and it is tough. And so they want to definitely put everything into it that they can. But I would say, as a strategist, no matter how you're communicating, you got to think about your strategy, no matter what arena you are in. And there's only so much when you really focus on audience analysis, as I've talked about with you over the years. That jury, mostly lay people, they have to take it in and then decipher. So when it gets to jury deliberations, do you really want to have them overwhelmed with evidence and rely on, well, what do they remember from, the first week of testimony of these 38 prosecution witnesses? So those are the kinds of things that the attorneys have to play into. However, it's a big case, and so I wasn't surprised to see that many witnesses, but my question, as just someone who questions some of the charges in this case, when it comes to you have to prove each element of a statutory crime. It isn't just what the Facebook video says, or it isn't just what your gut feeling is, or how bad the optics looked with Derek Chauvin there. It is, can the prosecution prove beyond reasonable doubt every element of that statutory crime? And in this case, we have 3 different statutory charges. So, the jury could come back hung on all 3 charges. They could come back and convict on 1 or more of the charges. They could also say not guilty on all of the charges. So there are different ways this could go, and it really does involve all 12 jurors agreeing to the same thing. And practicing attorneys tell me in jury deliberations, as far as the doubt goes, you want at least 2 or 3 people who have doubt, because if there's only one who has doubt, it is a hung jury. However, there's a lot of urging from the judge to go back and, reconsider. So the 2 to 3 jurors having doubt is really what Eric Nelson is hoping for his side of the case.
In terms of the defense attorney, Eric Nelson, and what the arguments have been, when you said that they successfully entered, in your view, Roshini Rajkumar, that they successfully entered reasonable doubt into the discussion, how did they do that? What do you think enabled them to enter in at least a little bit of reasonable doubt?
Well, and it came at different places, right? So sometimes it was in the cross-examination of a medical or use of force expert, and sometimes it was in their case in chief when the defense had its own witnesses. So, for example, when the defense had its use of force expert, which was earlier this week, he was able to say, and I think help us understand more the totality of the circumstances. And they did show some video of all 3 officers trying to get George Floyd under control. He was a big guy. That was hard to do for those 3 officers. And all of that led up to him finally being on the ground and Derek Chauvin, putting part of his body on him. So I believe that witness was able to show us some of the differences between compliance, when you get aggression or pushback from a suspect, and what is in the natural course of police work, what happens. Because we have to remember, we know all these things now 10 months later, but in that moment, not as much was known about George Floyd by those 4 officers who were on the scene, and definitely by Derek Chauvin, who came in even after the 2 rookie officers did. So I believe that witness for the defense gave us a little more insight and at least a line and roadmap to follow that he could have just been doing his normal work, subduing, because officers are taught not to stop, they're not licensed to kill or licensed to injure. They are taught to stop the threat, whatever that means. And that threat is both to themselves and to the public around them, and sometimes also to the suspect themselves. So that was one area. And then there were a couple moments with both use of force experts for the prosecution and medical witnesses for the prosecution, as well as the former girlfriend of George Floyd who testified that, the prosecution brought her, if I believe that's right, they brought her as their witness, and Eric Nelson used her in his case, for just a sliver of information to get out that George Floyd was sleeping and he had to be aroused from sleep. So there are all those different things. Any kind of doubt, any room for doubt, Jimmy, opens up that window of reasonable doubt, which is the standard the prosecution has to prove. And people sometimes mistakenly think the defense has to prove there was another way Derek Chauvin died versus the way the prosecution is telling us. That's not the burden the defense has. The burden is just for the defense is to enter doubt. They don't even have to give us an alternate theory, although they did give us some alternate theories to what the prosecution was saying.
And we're talking with Roshini Rajkumar in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And when you talk about reasonable doubt and you talk about the process that the jury has to go through, one of the things that's been so surprising to me, quite frankly, is that this trial is happening in Minneapolis in the first place. And then you had Sunday's tragedy, and we'll talk about that in the next segment with you, Roshini, in Brooklyn Center, when a police officer shot and killed Daunte Wright, 20-year-old black man. Then we saw riots come from that. And as you said, that spilled over into Minneapolis, which already has just been reeling from riots and massive crime increases and all of that. I worry about intimidation of the jury, that they may feel like they have to or feel more inclined to convict in part because they're worried about the consequences to the community of this, especially because the defense, for example, earlier this week asked the judge to sequester the jury as things were descending more into chaos once again, and he declined to do so. So what do you make of that component right now, Roshini?
Well, I have to continue to put my faith in the jury that they really take seriously the role, the job in front of them, and that they won't be swayed by what they've got to know is going on around them in some way. I was not shocked that the judge denied that defense motion to sequester after Sunday's events happened because, stuff happens and you can't sequester juries every time something else happens. It was just, this was very close to home. So it was smart of Eric Nelson to make that motion. I was not shocked that it was denied. But I am concerned about juror safety in general. I'm actually more concerned about juror safety than I am about the jurors feeling pressured to go one way or another. I really do feel that they are looking at this evidence, and again, they are looking at it in far more detail than we are, even though on the outside, as much as I've watched it and have given analysis, nobody is seeing the stuff as firsthand and as up close and in a repeated manner once they go into deliberations, and they can ask questions of the judge and all those kinds of things. Monday will be important because the judge will be giving jury instructions, and that was part of how Thursday was spent, with the attorneys ironing out exactly how those jury instructions will go. So that's very important also, that they listen to those instructions. And as you know, Derek Chauvin decided not to take the stand in his own defense, and that is a right. It is a privilege of every defendant, and they will be instructed that they shouldn't read anything into that on Monday. But, they're human. You don't know what they'll read into that. So it will be very interesting to see. I can't imagine it's going to be a quickie deliberation, but I feel we will have some verdict by the end of next week, again, if there's not a plea agreement that comes ahead of that.
We're going to take a quick break. Jimmy Sengenberger in for Peter Boyles this morning, talking with Roshini Rajkumar live in Minneapolis. When we return, we'll spend a few minutes more with Roshini and talk in part about this, the Brooklyn Center shooting death of Daunte Wright on Sunday, and the issue, and an issue that I know is very important to Roshini as it is to me, of due process and how you handle sensitive and important case like the Derek Chauvin trial, or how you handle what happened on Sunday and where politicians are going with all this. We're going to talk about the important role of due process on the other side. Once again, Jimmy Sengenberger in for Peter Boyles here on News Talk 710 KNUS.
News Talk 710 KNUS. Listen live at radio.com. Peter Boyles. News Talk 710 KNUS.
I'm on a work a week, I make $100. And hit the road again. So I don't want you to.
I know, gotta love this kind of music. I know. The Marshall Tucker Band, Southern Rock. I was raised with great parents. Jimmy Sengenberger in for Peter Boyles by great parents who have phenomenal taste in music. So I was raised with Marshall Tucker and the Allman Brothers Band. Best band ever. I will debate anybody on that point, that the Allman Brothers Band is the best band ever, but Marshall Tucker, you gotta love him. Gotta love Southern Rock. So many phenomenal bands. But let's get back to the discussion. Once again, Jimmy Sengenberger in for Peter Boyles. And later when we open up for the phones again, if somebody wants to argue with me about the best band ever, I'm game for that. Roshini Rajkumar joins me here on 710 KNUS. She is the host of Real Talk with Roshini on WCCO Radio in Minnesota. She is joining us live from Minneapolis, where all eyes are on the jury as they gear up for jury instructions on Monday and to go into deliberation. She is a licensed attorney and former TV reporter, author of the book Communicate That, because she is a communications coach and crisis coach. Roshini, so appreciate your time today. And I want to shift gears slightly to focus more on what happened in Brooklyn Center on Sunday when a police officer shot and killed Dante Wright, 20-year-old black man who was resisting arrest and ended up being shot when this police officer, Officer Kim Porter, shot him, but apparently thinking that it was a taser. What do we know about what happened on Sunday? Obviously, with more information needed to come out, which, of course, we'll get to the fundamental point I want to touch on in a moment, which is due process. But what do we know now about what happened in Brooklyn Center, a small suburb of Minneapolis, on Sunday, Roshini?
Yeah, it is a suburb. It has a small police force, and even after last year's events in Minneapolis, Brooklyn Center was losing some of its officers. So a small force, and what we do know is that Dante Wright was stopped for what appeared to be some sort of traffic violation. But when they ran the plates, there were warrants out for his arrest, a bench warrant in the very least. And as I've learned from some of my police sources, those were for some gun charges. So, I think there's a lot being made about him being pulled over for an air freshener. Well, I don't know about that as far as there are statutes that say you can't have distracting things hanging from your windshield. So, who knows? Were there many? Was there one? I don't know, but there's a lot that's being made about that. But the essence of the whole thing is there were warrants out for him. And that officer, Kim Potter, very sadly, when it looked like he was resisting arrest, the other officer who was there with her, there were two, but the one on the driver's side, as I understand it, was being trained by her that day, was not able to get him into cuffs, partly because he was resisting. He tried to get back into his car, and there's also been more made about why was he right at the driver's door. He should have been moved to the back of the car. So a lot of those kinds of things will come out. And she drew what she thought was her taser, but it was the gun, and we know what happened. So he was shot, he drove a little further, and then eventually died. And that's what we know about that. She was arraigned. The charges are second-degree manslaughter, which most legal people will tell you, some that I've interviewed myself as a lawyer will say that seems like the fair charge in this case. It does really seemed like it was an accident now, a terrible accident, tragic, and you wonder how a veteran law enforcement officer could make that mistake. But we also have to remember people are human, so I can't say I've never made a mistake on the air when there's an open mic. I can't, I can't fault the human mistake side of it, but it will open up questions and has already about training and who are officers and what, who should be doing what. But the fact is she is charged, and that arraignment, her attorney is Earl Gray. Earl Gray, I talked with him on my show a few weeks ago. He is representing one of the rookie officers from the George Floyd incident. So he wanted cameras in the court for these cases, did not want for Kim Potter. And Minnesota law says if even one party objects, you can't have cameras in the court. And in this case, the prosecution agreed with them, so there are no cameras. And if there is a trial, I doubt there will be cameras, but we shall see on that. I also have a prediction, Jimmy, that she will plead out on this. Personally, as a Minneapolis resident, I don't know that our community can handle another trial like this. But, that's going to be up to her and her attorney. She had, even before the charges came out, she had moved her family out of the town that she lives in. And, now is in custody. So all of that is just so tragic, very sad, and it's something that we're following. But last night, the fifth night of protests in Brooklyn Center, it was, from reports I'm seeing, it was a lot quieter than the previous few nights.
Yeah, the Dollar Tree incident, when that was absolutely ransacked and just destroyed, was absolutely devastating to me. To see that happen and recognize, too, that that is a kind of store where lower income people go to shop because of more affordable prices for different things, or have jobs that then they have to they're not able to work because they need to wait until the store is back into shape. And it truly is a travesty too when you have that kind of devastating destruction. But there's something else that I really want to get at, and I've been alluding to due process of law. Earlier in the show, we spent a good amount of time talking about what an individual right is and how it's the ability to do something, to the sovereign ability to act, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, constitutional right to constitutionally protect natural right to keep and bear arms, so on and so forth. But in part of that actually entails some things that government must do in order to protect your rights. So you do have rights from government that they must oblige to you in order to protect your fundamental rights. And one of those is due process of law. There is a really tremendous piece from earlier this week by Professor Jonathan Turley at George Washington University. It's entitled Brooklyn Center Unrest as More Problems in Trial of Derek Chauvin. And what he talks about is the incident on Sunday that resulted in Daunte Wright's death. And the fallout from that. So you have the Brooklyn Center city manager, Kurt Boganey, was made to resign. Of course, Officer Potter was made to resign. That was the officer who shot and killed Daunte Wright. And then Minnesota Governor Tim Walz denounces, quote, another life of a black man taken by law enforcement, and, as Turley summarizes it, made a connection to the trial of police officer Derek Chauvin occurring a few miles away. And Turley says this, Roshini, I want to get your reaction and expand, please, upon due process. Due process is not a dirty word or a dog whistle. Boganey was trying to do what Waltz was unwilling to do and respect the rule of law. Your thoughts, Roshini Rajkumar?
Absolutely. I think that was a very reckless statement. It was not by way of tweet and other ways that Governor Walz put that out, because when we short-circuit due process for one person, the rest of us are screwed. Everyone's screwed, Jimmy. I mean, I've said this over and over again. This is why we have to remember innocent until proven guilty is the law of our land. That is the promise that our Constitution gives to every citizen. Even if you are that officer who made a horrendous mistake and pulled her gun instead of a taser, even you, Kim Potter, get due process. It's promised of everyone, because once it's taken away from one, then all of us are definitely in jeopardy of not getting due process. And this is why I know you and I are so committed to this promise of our Constitution. And wars have been fought, laws have been changed, battles in court have happened when due process gets sideswiped. And we can't just allow emotion to take over. It was a very reckless statement by the governor, my governor of Minnesota. I have been critical of him in the past. I was critical of him for some of his actions last summer. And I definitely was stunned by that tweet, and I can tell you other members of the media couldn't believe that he had also done that. And so that's really where, if you're going to insert yourself as a politician, why not choose the side of healing versus throwing more flames into this fire or more coals into this fire?
I think this kind of ties in as well with the fact that the city of Minneapolis settled with George Floyd's family while the trial was gearing up. And then the trial happens, and you have this thing that is in the back of everybody's mind about how the city basically conceded and said, hey, this was wrong and we're settling with you before the trial happened. That arguably could be said to be interfering a little bit with due process as well.
Exactly. That was happening, I believe it was the Friday of the first week of jury selection, and Eric Nelson did make a motion for, extreme prejudice on that and wanted to declare basically a mistrial because of that, and that was not allowed. Jury selection continued, as we know. But definitely, as someone who's a strategist and coaches communication, the optics on that are terrible. The mayor was on stage with the Floyd family when that was announced, and, the protocol on settlements like this, you can know that the settlement is happening or in the works or even has been agreed upon. You don't need to announce it before a very volatile and emotional trial. You can wait. You also don't need to have a press conference where the mayor is standing there with the family of George Floyd before we even have anything proven in a court of law. So that was not a good moment by our mayor or our city council in a long line of many not-so-great moments since last summer. And I will say that it is also starting to bankrupt. I'm questioning the coffers of the city of Minneapolis, Jimmy, because this money is taxpayer money. I live in Minneapolis. This money doesn't grow on trees. It's taxpayer money. So that is also another part of it, obviously less dramatic than the human life and all of those things, but the timing of that was terrible, and I still am stunned that happened when it did.
Finally, Roshini Rajkumar, I know you're going to be on Court TV on Monday and Tuesday talking about the trial. Is there anything else you think folks should keep in mind?
Yeah, folks, definitely all over the country. I'm glad that there's interest because one silver lining is people are learning more and more about how the system works. And even though this is the trial of one person, it helps us to see how justice should be working and how prepared attorneys should be and how judges act and instructions to juries. And really, it's boring. It's not the sexy stuff we see on primetime TV. Mm-hmm. The work of the justice system can be very boring, and for justice to truly be served, each step needs to be taken, can't be short-circuited. So I'm really happy that Court TV's cameras are inside the courtroom so that all of us can see it through whatever channel you're watching or visually you're watching or listening. And I'm looking forward to being on again with Court TV. It's been wonderful doing some commentary for them and lending my voice to the analysis. Mm-hmm. And, they have various lawyers who come on, and not everyone's from Minneapolis, so it's also nice to be on there representing the city where these actions are happening. And,
right.
I think they do like some of that perspective from the ground.
Oh, that's exactly why I wanted to have you. Well, one of two reasons, of course. We always enjoy having your perspective on anything. I certainly enjoy that, but especially being there in Minneapolis and watching this so closely, being a part of that community that has been reeling from this for nearly a year now. Roshini Rajkumar, licensed attorney, WCCO, Minneapolis radio host. So great to have you. Thanks so much for taking the time to join us today, and best wishes to you and to your community.
Thank you, Jimmy. And on a lighter note, Fleetwood Mac, definitely the best band of all time.
We can discuss this another time because that is not correct. That is just plain wrong. It's the Allman Brothers Band. Roshini Rajkumar, We have to end on Discord, do we? That's a pity. All right. Thank you so much for joining us here on the show. Really appreciate it. Roshini Rajkumar once again joining us on 710 KNUS. I'm definitely going to have to talk to her about that one. That's for sure.